Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is a familiar face, Kat Rosenfield. Kat, welcome back, and can you please introduce yourself?
Hi. Thanks so much for having me. And yes, I'm Kat Rosenfield, freelance writer, novelist, owner of an extremely determined interrupting cat, former Blogging Heads entity, and girl about town.
And so you are the co-host of Feminine Chaos, which formerly was on the Blogging Heads platform and now continues on an independent platform. And so people can, if people maybe didn't realize that you left the platform, wondering where you are, they can still they can subscribe to that. It's episodes are on early on Patreon, and you get bonus stuff, and then there's the public feed also. So the links to those things will be below. And but we're here to talk about your new novel, which I'm holding up to the camera right now. No one will miss her. Um, and so thank you for coming on. And I just finished the book last night and enjoyed it a lot. Um, and so for maybe people who remember you from the site talking about culture and politics and gender relations and so forth, you before that were a writer of primarily young adult fiction, or as well. And this is your first. Is it adult, or what is it?
My first solo adult
Okay.
novel. Prior to this, I collaborated with Stan Lee on an adult novel called A Trick of Light, and but that was something I did with him, and this is just me. So yeah, but before that, I published two young adult novels before being sort of excommunicated from YA, and now I'm trying my hand at something a little bit more grown up.
Yeah, I think you've succeeded. And yeah, the piece that you wrote in New York Magazine, right, about YA, Twitter toxic YA, was the first time you came on Plugins, I think, about in 2017 or so. Um, but you left you left that strange world behind, and so this book, what do you have? You must have a sort of a one or two line summary of the book. What is
Yes,
it?
we're calling it Gone Girl for the Gig Economy.
The cat wants to make his presence known.
The cat's maybe upset about the part of the book where I, viciously wrote on the page a cat murder.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk
He
about that
seems to he
about
likes
that
to
that part.
interrupt. Yeah, we can talk about that. That's not like a huge spoiler. Um, but yeah, Gone Girl for the gig economy. Basically, the idea is, to kind of explore the transactional relationships that we, in particular, that women have with each other in our present moment, and how that impacts our conception of self. There's also some questions of identity and sort of public face in there, whether it's identity that you are assigned by reputation or one that you project yourself online. So a lot of the same stuff that I like to kind of cover as a cultural writer and journalist, I would say that this book is sort of exploring that from a different angle.
That's interesting. Um, and yeah, I felt like there were influences of also, so like sort of a Hitchcock influence. I felt that was in there, and some Gone Girl also. I'm not a huge reader of thrillers, but I did read Gone Girl, and this is, yeah, definitely a page turner, and has, well, we'll talk about the narrator, but yeah, female main characters, um and a twist, but we will not spoil the twist. Of course, we will possibly allude to a twist that caught me unawares. Okay, do you want to maybe just even read the first line? You probably know the first line by memory. What first line is very striking.
The first line is, "My name is Lizzie Willette, and if you're reading this, I'm already dead."
Yeah. So how did you start at that point? That's a great first line, and I think anyone who hears that wants to know what's going to come next. And it's Woolette. That's the character's last name.
Willette, yeah, it's up in the wilds of Maine. There, you have a pretty strong French Canadian influence, or just French, I guess, and so there's lots of um, French surnames there.
Okay, so and I think I alluded to the fact that I started reading this and it almost like blew my mind the first time I started reading it. I had to stop and go back to it because I was like, what does this mean? I'm already dead. And then I was thinking things about, narrators beyond the grave and, or did she write this down? And it's a found manuscript or something. And it was, it boggled my mind so much that I had to take a break and return to it. But, how did you, how do you, well, what, when you were writing this, which sort of parts came first? The plot, the characters, the setting? What where how did this come together for you?
So the sort of fundamental, like, what the fuck moment that you reach about midway through the book is the thing that I was building on and toward. It sort of began with, what if a book where this happened? What if a story where this happens? And from there, I had instantly these two couples in mind, whose lives intersect in interesting and eventually catastrophic and tragic ways. And from there, I'm trying to think. I think the setting was one of the that came later, but it was very pivotal to this story taking the shape that it did. Once I decided that it was going to be in rural New England, um, a lot of other things kind of came into play. Things about the lifestyle of a place like that. Things like the opioid crisis that's affecting rural areas in New England, upstate New York, Cape Cod, places like that. So yeah, it started with with the one idea, and then it just sort of bloomed out from there. And the decision to have Lizzie narrate from Beyond the Grave, um, I partly, a dead narrator can get away with certain things that a living one cannot. Um, but I just sort of loved her voice once I started writing in it. It was just, I felt like she was really close by and accessible and kind of fun, so that even if you weren't sure if she was telling you the truth, you would enjoy listening to her tell her story.
So did this so we mentioned before you previously wrote in the young adult genre and then sort of left that behind, maybe burn the bridges. I don't know. Was this, were you thinking I want to write for an adult audience now and then this came to you, or how did, how did that shift happen? And also like what were the differences between writing for an adult audience and writing for a young adult audience?
There's not really a huge difference in terms of, for me, when I was writing YA, I got into it at sort of this peak YA moment. I don't know if you remember, like back in 2010 to 2012, basically everybody was suddenly reading young adult novels, and like all of the adaptations that were happening in Hollywood, it was all YA being
That's when Hunger
adapted.
Games
Everyone
came out
was,
and
yes, exactly, exactly. So at that time, there was just this sense of incredible possibility in young adult fiction. You could be very experimental. You could write stuff that was very literary. You could explore very mature themes as long as your characters were teenagers. And excuse me, that was how I sort of ended up in that space. That was the point at which I ended up in that space. I wasn't intending when I started writing my first novel that it was going to be a young adult novel, but then the main character, ended up being a teenager. She's 18 and she's just graduated high school. So just by dint of that, at the time, that made it a young adult novel. And I was writing for an editor who did a lot of work with more literary authors. John Green was one of her authors, Nova Rensuma, Jandy Nelson. So we were all kind of occupying this little sphere together, doing stuff that was more adult thematically, but was just being written for teenagers. And so I would say, there are certain things that you can't do in YA. Like, you're not supposed to curse quite as much. You're not supposed to include sexually explicit content. I was able to be much more frank in this novel than about sex, and I guess probably in terms of including like gore. Not that there's a ton of it, but there's a little.
yeah, I was actually, I mean, as a not a non-thriller reader generally, I was sort of surprised by some of the Glorious. One moment in particular, which maybe we can guess what I'm thinking of, but we don't need to discuss. But it happens towards the beginning. Yeah, there's definitely some gory parts.
The garbage disposal. Yeah, yeah. What can I say? I just kind of I wanted people to know what they were getting into. Um, but I didn't intentionally leave YA behind. I wouldn't say that I burned bridges. I obviously did not make a ton of friends by reporting truthfully, but in a way that was, not necessarily flattering to certain people in the community about the dynamics that were starting to take hold there. Which I did just because it was so interesting. I happened to be a fly on the wall at the time when a lot of this stuff was kind of emerging, and the discourse in that arena was getting pretty wild, and I was like, this is worth discussing, especially because of the impact it was having on the actual teens for whom we were supposed to be writing, and ostensibly for whom we cared a great deal. That said, I also ended up, I think I would have ended up moving away from YA anyway, because I did always want to write for adults, and because the sort of openness of that literary space stopped being as much of a thing as peak YA passed us by, and suddenly there was less opportunity and there was less money, and completely apart from the fact that a lot of the fiction being greenlit starting around, I want to say like 2015, 2016, was sort of more explicitly political in certain ways uh, than what I wanted to write. Um, yeah, I just think it was starting to kind of close up, and there was just less room to do the kind of work that I wanted to do there.
The main character, Lizzie, who is the narrator, um, from the very start, and you have chapters that differ in narration. Um, how did tell us about this character, and sort of how did she come to you?
So Lizzie Willette is our only person narrator. She's dead at the start of the book. Um, she is narrating from beyond the grave, describing the history of her marriage, her relationships with people in this small town where she's always lived, where she's always been sort of a pariah, an outsider, somebody who people loathed because they needed someone to hate. She was renting out her lake house. It was, one of these few perks of living in this town was having property on this lake. And she, unlike a lot of people in town, was willing to rent to outsiders. As a fun fact about rural New England, if a lot of rural areas that have a sort of a large moneyed summer population are already mistrustful of outsiders, but in Maine specifically, if somebody is not from the town that you're in, then they're just referred to as from away. It's like this very suspicious kind of attitude towards outsiders. So Lizzie is one of the few people who's willing to put her property on the internet and rent to people who are from away. And she does this and ends up crossing paths with the Richards, specifically a woman named Adrienne Richards, who's an influencer and the wife of this disgraced billionaire who almost went to prison but didn't, for a sort of a Bernie Madoff style financial scheme. So Lizzie's like, she's trailer trash, and she's pretty upfront about that the entire time that you are hearing her story. And so she tells you in this very straightforward way, how she ended up dead on the floor of the lake house that she was renting to this couple from out of town.
And okay, so did you well, how did you so we'll talk about the setting a little bit, that what you mentioned. So you live in New England, but sort of southern New England. And why did you decide on Maine as the main setting? Also, some scenes take place in Boston, right? When they return to where the wealthy couple lives. How did you decide? I mean, Stephen King has claimed Maine or rural Maine in some respects. How did you decide to set the
Stephen
book
King
there.
doesn't own Maine, all right? The state doesn't belong to him. But Maine is a great setting for a couple of different reasons. I mean, one, it's just a really interesting place. The sort of community dynamics that rule, especially in its small towns, are really interesting. It's right on, a substantial portion of the Appalachian Trail runs through there. So, in addition to being a sort of a vacation setting for a lot of moneyed people, you just have a lot of kind of transient folks coming through, which is an interesting thing, an interesting dynamic to have in a place that is relatively suspicious of, non-Mainers. And I've spent a lot of time in Maine throughout my life. I've been going there every year since I was a kid. Both sets of grandparents lived in Maine. And let's see, what else were we talking about? Oh, the reason to set it there. Oh, another thing about Maine that is interesting is that if you get enough into the hinterlands, and this is useful for thriller writers, there are places still where there is no cell phone service, just like 0 bars. And since one of the things that is a big challenge if you're writing contemporary thrillers is constantly trying to find ways for people to like lose their cell phones or not have access to them, because, unfortunately they would solve a lot of problems that we try to create as thriller writers. Setting your story in Maine is one way to kind of get around that little obstacle.
Yeah, I just recently was listening to a podcast where they were talking about this, how so many classic plot lines, even, of thrillers or movies from the 80s or sitcoms from the 90s, how many Seinfeld plot lines could have been, if there had been cell phones, then the core difficulty would have easily been surmounted. So okay, that makes sense. And um okay, so you felt like the character Lizzie, sort of, she was the strongest one that came to you. Were you always thinking that she's going to be the narrator, for or how did you decide how, like, the sort of the structure of how you're going to tell the story?
I like to play with different perspectives in all of my work. I think that I'm trying to think if I've ever written a book that didn't have multiple different narrators and different perspectives. I don't think I have. It's something that I really like to do as a writer. It's an opportunity to play with different voices, and also, by having multiple narrators, it allows you to, in some cases, shield certain information from the reader, but also it allows you to let the reader in on things that, from kind of an omniscient perspective that they wouldn't otherwise have, or that like other characters in the book don't have, so that they can ultimately see how everything kind of pans out and works together, and they have information that is not necessarily available to the people in the book that they're reading. So, as far as Lizzie being the narrator, she's just a lot of fun. I think that, if anybody was going to be telling this story in the first person, it should be her.
Hmm. And so, you have the timeline. The book takes place in the fall of 2018, right? Like, you have specific dates that are mentioned, and so you also have, like you said, there's one of the characters is an Instagram influencer, and internet access and listing a summer property on Airbnb plays a role. How did how did you decide that you weren't going to set this in sort of the eternal present, or maybe not, in 2007 or something? Did 2018, how did you make that specific choice?
I'm trying to think about this. I ultimately, I knew that I wanted baseball to play a certain amount of a role in this story. Baseball intervenes to make certain things possible within the story, without spoiling anything. So I spent a lot of time sort of looking. Let's see. I definitely needed a moment in the recent past when there was like a really kind of serious matchup in the, what was it, like American League Division series. So it would have been the Yankees versus the Red Sox. Basically, I needed that game, and rather than just inventing one, I was like, all right, I'm just gonna find it. I remembered watching it. And I remembered that it was pretty intense at the time. So yeah, so I had these sort of existing markers, this baseball series that ended up playing a sort of a minor, but still, an important role in the way that the story unfolded. The other thing is that a lot of the thematic um, subjects that I'm tackling, issues of identity, issues of performance, issues of, the transactional relationships that we form with people who are basically paying to do stuff for us. And we imagine that they're our friends, but really it's a completely transactional relationship. All of this is stuff that's really very right now. So to set this story in 2018 as opposed to like, sort of pre-smartphone, it allowed me to kind of play with that stuff.
Mhm. Um, and okay, so there's a couple of characters we haven't mentioned. So one is Lizzie's husband Dwayne, and another is the detective who comes on the scene. He's the state detective. Is that right?
Yeah, he's a state trooper.
Right. So he's also an outsider to this very small community and comes in. And his name is Ian Bird.
The only
Can you
good
talk
man
a little
in the
bit about?
book.
Sorry, say that
I said he's the only good man in the book.
again. Can you? Yeah. So talk a little bit about those characters and how you conceive them.
So Dwayne's just the worst. He is based on anybody specific, but he's definitely a type of guy. If you've ever spent a lot of time in a small town, you might be sort of familiar with, and then things that happen in his life conspire to make him even more of a certain type of guy. There's sort of a lot of squandered potential there, but also a sense that it was lucky that he was sort of knocked off of his intended path before he discovered that he couldn't walk it himself. He's just sort of a bad dude, incurious about the world. Kind of hates his wife, but needs her, but resents her. Not that he's the only person in the marriage who feels that way. There's a sort of a codependency going on there in certain ways. So that's Dwayne. And then Ian Bird basically exists because I needed somebody to investigate this crime who would not necessarily know what was going on. And, because police do investigate crimes, even in rural Maine. So, yeah, that's basically why he exists. But I got interested in him, in terms of, I mean, he's sort of the closest thing to an avatar for the audience. He's a spectator to everything that's happening. So at the start, he and the reader are figuring things out together. Eventually, because the reader has the advantage of, of being inside multiple people's heads, the reader figures things out before he does.
Right. Um, how did you, and this could be in general or specific, so a character named Detective Ian Bird, Detective Ian Bird. How do you pick your names for your fictional creations?
It depends on who it is. I don't remember where I came up with Ian Bird's name. I think I wanted somebody who sounded like they could be sexy, basically. And I don't know, Bird is just it's a nice name. But when I'm setting a story in a particular location, I tend to go and look at either like not genealogy. What is it where you find out who's buried in historic cemeteries? Like if I need a family who's been in the area for a long time, I'll look at the prevalent surnames there. Um, if I'm looking for people who are more contemporaneous, I look at high school basketball rosters, and I just I just mix them, or like high school sports. It really doesn't have to be basketball, but I just mix and match, like from what's there, because I'm really terrible at picking names. So I just have to I have to find existing human beings to steal first and last names.
Okay, and so Willette is a French Canadian origin. And how did you? So in my head, I was saying it Oulette. And did you think about that? Well, so how do you? Yeah, how did you chose a name obviously that's somewhat unusual in the English speaking America? Why did you make that choice?
Well, I mean, it's, when people who were, it's spelled Ouellette. So when people who had that surname left a French inflected region and went somewhere else, they became Willet,
Oh,
Willet.
okay.
So I wanted something that was old school New England, but that also sounded vaguely kind of yokel-y, I guess. Yeah, something that was tied to that region, going way back, but not in a posh way.
Okay, interesting. Um, so let's see. So the you're so Adrian, the influencer character, Adrian Richards, um, where did so that where did that character come from? And if I assume Lizzie came to you first, then you were thinking about a foil or some sort of paired character for the two female leads of the book. How did yeah, where did that come from? And is this based on anyone in your real life or people you noticed via Instagram or
Not saying that would not be flattering to whoever it was. No, I mean, I feel like I don't really have the best or most interesting answers to these questions. A lot of this stuff where it's like, how did this come to you? It's, I was writing and I thought of it. I wish that I had a better sense of what happens somewhere in the back of my brain when I get an idea. But, a lot of this stuff just seems to kind of manifest out of thin air.
okay, that yeah, inspiration is mysterious when it comes to the arts. So that makes sense. Um did okay, so we mentioned a twist. We will not spoil the twist, of course, but when you conceived of there being a twist and then also that this is a book you're going to be talking about, how did you think about that? And I don't know. I mean, it's a good twist. It's M Night Shyamalan in his original iteration, worthy, I would say. Yeah, how did you think about that? Or especially because it takes a long time to write a novel, and people, it's gestating for a long time, and multiple people are seeing it and stuff like that.
I feel like we're dancing so close to describing what the twist is. I'm like, please stop talking. But so I think, to kind of zoom out to a more like, here's how you construct a thriller kind of a discussion. The twist is, in this case, it happens midway through the book. So I knew that I was writing towards it. The way that I think of it is as, I'm constructing basically a labyrinth, and there's a monster sitting at the center of it, like the Minotaur. And you have to create a way through this maze for the reader so that they understand that they're heading towards something. Not necessarily that they know exactly where it is. They don't necessarily know that it's in the center, but they know that they're heading towards something. Pretty much every thriller includes a twist. And so they know it's coming. Savvy readers can and should be able, in a well constructed thriller, to anticipate what is going to happen before it happens. They should have the pleasure of figuring it out a little bit ahead of the narrative. People who are very, very savvy thriller readers can probably figure it out in the first chapter, but more power to them. Please don't spoil the book. But either way, the idea is, even for people who figured it out right away in the first chapter, you want them to enjoy the journey as they go there. So here you are, writing towards this thing that everybody knows is coming, and you know what it is, but you have to keep it obscured, and you have to make the journey to that point as interesting as possible so that people aren't getting bored and just, trying to skip ahead to find out what happens. And in this case, you write your way to the twist, and then, the reader and the Minotaur join hands and wander out of the maze together. So just to take this metaphor as far as it can possibly go, maybe a little further.
hmm Yeah, I'm not a savvy thriller reader, and so the twist worked effectively on me. And yeah, and the sort of constructing a narrative so that the twist, I guess some people could anticipate the twist, other people are taken by surprise. I'm thinking like I never read any Agatha Christie novels until I was like 30 years old, and then I read um, Murder on the Orient Express, which is the most famous one. And spoiler alert, the twist in that one is that everyone is guilty, and that's a famous celebrated twist. And then I was like, oh, this is fun. I'll try another one, and I just picked one randomly, and it was this similar thing with like a dead body and a dozen or so possible suspects, and then the identified in the end, the murderer who was identified in the explanation for it was so outlandish that it was like there's no possible way any reader could anticipate this as happening, and I felt like, wait, she just pulled this out of the hat. This makes no sense at all, and adding in details after the fact to explain the logic of it, and yeah, and you wouldn't have, yeah, it just seemed like she had randomly picked one of the names and then decided afterwards why that person was the murderer. I found that very unsatisfying, and I did not read any more Agatha Christie
I think
novels
this is the
after.
thing. If you're trying to write a story where people cannot guess, who the killer was, and you can't go back and say, "Oh, I see how this was, constructed." If it's just completely out of the blue, people feel really cheated. Even people who complain about being able to guess the twist too soon, they want to be able to do that, and they get really angry if they can't.
Yeah, yeah, it did feel like the genre is such that or detective novels or something with a twist, you should be sort of like playing detective yourself and being able to possibly put the clues together. And then if it's just out of left field, if the answer just out of left field, it feels like yeah, you were sort of taken for a ride or something. Um okay, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I could ask. What is it like um writing a book like this when you are also a noted cultural writer and commentator and talking head and so forth? How do you see those roles interacting or not interacting?
I think that, a lot of the same stuff that interests me as a culture writer also interests me as an author of fiction. I'd like to approach the same questions and the same problems. I like to kick over the same rocks and be like, what's wriggling around under there? And so, you know, I would say that there's a nice balance for me in being able to do this stuff. The only downside is that I am incredibly busy all the time, but that's not so terrible.
Yeah, there are worse things that one could be. So that's pretty good. Okay, well, I encourage people to check out the book. Like I said, I'm not a thrill reader usually, but I did quite enjoy it. No one will miss her, and people, and I think it went on sale a week ago, so people can find it wherever. But we did. You teased before we started recording that you had read and reviewed the work of another well-known person who wrote a thriller, and that is Hillary Clinton, who published a thriller just recently, like within the past month, right? Um, yeah, they that's some real counter programming. And and I guess like Bill Clinton has been writing with James Patterson has been writing novels for a while, and so I guess this is sort of uh along this similar lines. And well, I mean, you're sort of in the biz, like does the famous person actually write the book? Like what is how does this actually work? Do they sort of just is it just a branding opportunity, or is Hillary Clinton sitting down and scratching her head and trying to figure out how the architecture of her novel comes together? What do you think is happening here?
Let me think about this. I would, just to be clear that I'm completely talking out of my ass right now. I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Mhm.
I think most likely what happened is that Clinton, and in this case, Louise Penny, who was the co-writer on the book, spent a bunch of time talking about the idea, the concept. So they had characters, they had a story roughly. Here's the frightening thing that is going to happen, or that will happen if our heroes don't manage to stave off disaster. Um, I'm gonna just wager that the actual writing was pretty much entirely the veteran thriller writer doing it, and not Hillary Clinton attempting to construct a fictional story for the first time in her life, especially one with as many twists and turns as this.
Well, there are plenty of people who think she concocted plenty of fictional stories previously about, say, what happened at Benghazi,
Oh, ha, ha, ha.
and what is happening in the basements of various pizza parlors and etc. But okay, sorry about that. But okay, so yeah, and probably I mean most it probably like Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton with their the works that they publish, nonfiction works, they probably are working with either a ghostwriter or help from professional writers because they're not professional writers. Maybe Obama is different because he wrote a book before he was famous, but most ex-politicians probably are working with someone else. But it is, I mean, what do you make of this genre of like the Politico who is retired who starts releasing thrillers that they may or they contributed to in some amount that we don't quite know?
I mean, I think it's fascinating. It's kind of interesting how we have these people who are like elder statesmen who retire into a life of making art, sort of. You've got George Bush doing his painting, and
Obama is a podcaster.
Obama has a podcast. I mean, he's sort of a media mogul, really. And then
yeah, he has like him and Michelle have a Netflix deal.
Yeah. Then you have, Bill Clinton is writing his thrillers with James Patterson, which I mean, the funny thing about these political thrillers by former politicos is that usually the protagonist is an avatar for the author. And in Bill Clinton's case, this means that, it's an ex-president and he's like so cool and virile, even in his dotage, that he's still like having shirtless canoe races with his Secret Service agent and winning all the time, which I think is just a hilarious little bit of wish fulfillment. Good on him. I hope he makes it real. But so Hillary Clinton's novel features, I thought this was interesting. Her hero is a female Secretary of State who has been tapped to serve in the cabinet of a political rival, much like Clinton was herself. We're talking about wish fulfillment. One of the things that I noted in my review for this book is that, I'm sure it took a certain amount of restraint not to make her an ex-president. But the thing that's also interesting to me is that it's hard to think of another person who's most famous for losing a presidential election who would then get to go on to have this kind of career, like the ex-presidential career, like Clinton, like George Bush, like Obama, despite not having actually served as president. But Hillary is getting to do this, and I think that is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, other person who comes to mind would be Gore, who, after losing in 2000 in a disputed way, started like eventually made an Inconvenient Truth, and like, you know, definitely kept on going working outside the, not an outside game instead of an inside game. What okay is the book worth reading? If you don't particularly care about Hillary Clinton either way,
it's better than Bill's.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's kind of, I don't know. I mean, is it okay if I like say a spoiler about the plot?
I'm not going to read it. But if anyone out there has it on, their Kindle, it just started, you might want to skip ahead.
Sorry, kids. But the thing that is sort of funny to me is that the big overarching evil plot, it turns out to be hatched by Americans who are in power, in positions of power in the government, in the military, in the civil sector, and they're so upset about gay marriage and illegal immigration and the lack of prayer in schools that they've decided en masse to stage a coup and to detonate 3 nuclear bombs in major American cities because they're so upset about gay marriage. It's kind of this progressive fever dream about how how backwards and destructive the folks on the right are, that they would actually set off nuclear weapons. They would bomb American cities just to get their way, which I don't know. I found that a little far-fetched, but also kind of funny in that it seems to kind of indicate this, almost like a wish to have that person to fight against. It's like, if they don't exist, we have to create them.
Okay, that's interesting. And yeah, I mean, it sounds like she has her own version of the deep state or something that is acting against the interests of all that is good and glorious about America. But
It's sort of like a fantasy where, like, if January 6th, instead of being what it was, had been like a very well organized, like genuine attempt to stage a coup with like an actual plan in place for afterwards, and also involved like a lot more bombs going off, like greater than zero bombs going off.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's sort of like that.
Okay, so thumbs down overall on the Hillary Clinton
I
Louise
think it's
Penny
no, it's a
thriller.
totally like, I wouldn't read it for like amazing political insights, but it's a completely serviceable political thriller. And it is a lot less boring, again, than Bill Clinton's books with James Patterson. But I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Louise Penny is just a better writer than James Patterson.
Okay, yeah, I'm not familiar with her. Like I said, I don't consume the genre generally. And Patterson, I just know because he's one of the most successful authors out there, and probably he at this point is not even writing his own James Patterson novels or
Yeah,
something. Or
probably not.
maybe so who knows what his actual involvement is. Um, well, that's interesting. Yeah, it is. I mean, thinking about why a former politician would embrace this versus something else, and I'm also thinking of a piece that came out a couple weeks ago in The Drift by Sophie Hegney, where she reviewed a lot of children's books by either by politicians or about politicians. And she was like, "These are all horrible. Like, like no child wants this." And I guess it's often like purchased as a gift, maybe for like a kid you don't know that well or something. You'll get them like the Elizabeth Warren, kids book, and Chelsea Clinton is the author of one of a series of these called She Persisted, I think. Um, and so there, yeah, so all three members of the Clinton family have sort of this publishing sideline or something, and yeah, are these like even really meant to be read primarily, or are they more like just a token of tribal affiliation or something you give as a gift and then it like sits it sits unread on the shelf? And actually just yesterday, and I posted this on Twitter, I was taking a walk in my neighborhood, and there was a copy of the She Persisted children's book on the street leaned up against a fire hydrant that I guess someone had just abandoned mid read and left left for someone else to take. And so um yeah, so I don't know, it is definitely a strange sort of thing that wasn't happening like 20 or 30 years ago. That
Yeah. I mean, leaving against a fire hydrant seems to me like a statement. I mean, that's basically not an invitation for somebody else to read it so much as it's an invitation for a dog to come pee on it.
Yes, that could be part of it. Um, and it looked unmolested when I saw it, but it could have been placed, mere moments before I walked by. But yeah, it's like, who is who is this actually for? But apparently they're super successful. That's why like there's this whole new genre of kiddie books and
Oh,
because
yeah.
they.
I would say that the children's literature is, like you were saying, more of a signifier. Like, you give that to your friend for her baby shower so that she knows that you're on the right side.
Right.
I would imagine that people who are reading Hillary Clinton's thriller are actually Hillary Clinton fans, you know, who just want to kind of support her in whatever it is that she's up to next.
Yeah, that makes sense. And yeah, and she did get 67 million votes or whatever. So there's if only 1 in 100 of those buys the book, then it's a smashing success. Um, yeah, okay. I don't think I will be reading that book anytime soon, but thank you for reading it yourself. And we'll include the link to your review. Where did that publish?
It's an unheard.
Okay. Let's see. Should we wrap it up there? Do you have anything else you want to mention or plug?
Oh God, yeah,
Before we
no. I
go?
mean, where could we possibly go after talking about Hillary Clinton's book? I think it can't possibly get better than this.
Well, I guarantee that this book is it'll be a more exciting read. And there are no nuclear bombs detonated by the deplorables or whatever in your book. So No One Will Miss Her is the book. Feminine Chaos. Where can people find that?
Oh, we have a Patreon, patreon.com/feminine chaos. I mean, Phoebe is currently, my co-host is currently on maternity leave. So I'm holding down the fort myself with a series of guests. And sorry, situation here. So we release one episode publicly per month, and then either an extended cut of that or two separate episodes for subscribers. So yeah, feel free to check it out. I don't consider myself primarily a podcaster, but I am still doing it. If you want to listen.
Yeah, and the I think it was the last one you released was you had Lee Stein, who has been on this program as well, and you were talking about the bad art friend.
Yes, we talked about Kidneygate. We had an actual altruistic kidney donor on to offer some insight, and she really said some incredibly interesting and valuable things. So, but yeah, if anybody is looking for information about that topic specifically,
I still see it's amazing. This is like, you know, people are still talking about the kidney story, and if you don't know what we're talking about, I guess you've been like in a fallout shelter or something for the past 3 weeks because this is like the first article that's like dominated the discourse that didn't have anything to do with Trump in a long time. But yeah, that was a fascinating conversation, actually, and in deep in interesting ways. And the woman who you had on, who also was an altruistic kidney donor, has a film, and that I feel like I want to check that out when it comes out because it's definitely a interesting
Penny
topic.
Lane, she's great. She has lots and lots of smart things to say about not just sort of the psychology of altruistic kidney donors, but about how that community functions. Lots of insights that gave me certainly a new understanding of what that story was actually about.
Yeah. So check that out, and you're on Twitter, and that is just Cat Rosenfield.
Yeah.
And so people should check you out all those places, and your writing appears in various other periodicals, including Unheard. Um, Anything else we should mention before wrapping up?
Oh gosh, no, I don't think so. I apologize for the cat and dog interruptions. But anybody who's missed me on Blogging Heads probably also missed them. So
Yes,
get your fix. Hello.
both pets got a cameo, and I know viewers who don't follow me on Twitter may not know this, but I actually have a cat who I adopted about 6 months ago, but he is extremely chill and lazy, and so he has no interest in what I'm doing, talking to the computer screen, and does not come and interrupt me. He just sleeps on the bed throughout, which is what he does most of the time. But if you like seeing photos of a cute orange cat, you can follow me on Twitter, RACW. And okay, well, Kat, thank you again. Thanks to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks.